Good afternoon, Next Church. My name is Bertram Johnson, and I'm on the Next Church strategy team, and it's my pleasure to be here with you all this afternoon. Specifically, it's my pleasure to introduce to you my friend Suzzanne Lacey, who is founding director of Museum Without Walls. It's an amazing organization that teaches the history of injustice and intolerance by visiting the places where it happened and connecting with people who have a close and personal connection to those stories. Suzzanne and I met over 20 years ago here in Seattle. We bonded immediately. We were 2 of the 10 African-American Presbyterians under the age of 40. I'm exaggerating, there were only 7. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to take part in Museum Without Walls trips and learning opportunities. We've visited trips locally here in Seattle surrounding the history of the Japanese internment. We've done work locally, or throughout the U.S., looking at the history of the experience of descendants of Africans who were enslaved in our ongoing fight for civil rights in this country. And we've done work across the globally, in Europe, focusing on the Holocaust and the experience of anti-Semitism. Together, we've witnessed how many are unwilling to confront the shameful part of our human history. And once, while we were in just outside of Prague, in Theresienstadt, if you know that concentration camp, the bus driver for our small charter group, there were about 30 of us or so, refused to take us back to our hotel. 30 of us, I think, right? And you could say maybe it was a language difficulty, but I think it was the fact that this group of Jews and Christians who came together to study the history of anti-Semitism and war and violence in his country, led by this black woman and this black man, together, he just didn't want to deal with that anymore, so he refused to take us back to the hotel. He took us to the airport, surprisingly, and so we arranged transportation from there. But regardless of the opposition that we've encountered, Suzzanne has been an advocate for people to tell their stories, to tell the truth of the pain and the oppression that they've seen both personally and systematically. And it's because of that truth that Museum Without Walls has transformed the lives of many churches and schools and students and people from around the U.S. and around the world. Suzzanne is a regionally awarded Emmy winner as a journalist. She's a dedicated Sunday school teacher at Bethany Presbyterian Church. But most importantly, she's a friend of mine, but also a woman with a deep faith in God to bring light into our lives and to help us see the struggles of our humanity so that by knowing more and by learning the truth, we can really do better for our churches, our schools, and our communities. Please welcome my friend Suzzanne Lacey.
My earphone thing is coming off here. It is a pleasure to be here. Any of you who know me know that I am an introvert. So when I got the call to come to talk about myself for 20 minutes, you can imagine the joy that was inside of me. I'm like, oh great, me for 20 minutes. So. But I am honored and glad to talk. A few years ago, I was talking with a group of third graders about civil rights history. Now, at that age, the history is pretty basic, right? So Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, and we had just spent time talking about Martin Luther King Jr. And we were about to go into Rosa Parks, and I asked the students, can anyone tell me who Rosa Parks was? And right away, this little girl raised her hand. Like, I know. No, there's always one, I know. So I said, okay, all right, so tell us all, who was Rosa Parks? And she looked at me straight in the eye and said, Rosa Parks was Martin Luther King Jr.'s wife. Okay. so close and yet so very far. I mean, we chuckle at that, but for many of us as students or as adults, we don't really have an intimate knowledge of civil rights history. So when I was in college and I had the opportunity to learn more, I almost let it pass me by. So I was working at an NPR station in Flagstaff, Arizona, and my father called me one day and he said, "Hey, I've got this great story idea for you." Now, I don't know how many of you have ever worked in journalism before, but when someone calls you to say that they have a really, really good story idea, 9 times out of 10, it's not that great. So I sort of avoided, actually, talking to my dad, but he was very persistent. And he knows that I love a good story, and he knows I love a story with strong historical significance. As a child, he and my other family members would, tell me stories about my great-grandparents who were slaves, and their son, who was a farmer and a teacher, and then, of course, his father, who was a professor. Dad insisted that me following the 30th anniversary of the Freedom Rides was a story that I really wanted to get behind. And at the time, he was vice president of the American Baptist College in Nashville, Tennessee. It's the alma mater to many of the civil rights foot soldiers, including Representative John Lewis. He had a coworker that had kept talking to him about this commemoration ride and how, his daughter should really cover it. His coworker turned out to be Bernard Lafayette. Dr. Lafayette was a freedom rider. He was a Nashville sit-in protester. He was the Selma voting rights organizer. He was arrested 27 times, including a stay in Parchment Prison, which is the Mississippi State Prison. My father was wrong. This was not a good story. This was a great story. And once I arrived down south, I was surrounded with all of these amazing people. I mean, I heard account after account from the movement. They were the most passionate, dynamic, interesting people I had ever met. James Farmer, who, if you've done any civil rights history reading, was another father of the movement. And after I'd interviewed him, he looked at me and he said, I rode that bus so you could hold that microphone that says NPR. And he was right. The bus was pretty full. So they ended up putting me in a car with 3 other freedom riders. And so we were in Jackson, Mississippi, and we were going to Memphis, and then from Memphis we were going back to Nashville. And so I was in the car with these 3 men that I didn't know. Upon reflection, I'm not sure that was probably the best way to go, but it turned out to be significant. These freedom riders wanted to take a detour. They wanted to go to Parchment Prison. As I mentioned before, that was the Mississippi State Prison. They had all been in prison there, and they wanted to see it. So we stood in a field across from the prison, and they recounted their stay there. They told me about sleeping on the cold floors because their mattresses had been taken away, about eating subpar food, about wondering if they would ever be released. And in the same breath, saying that they wouldn't do a thing differently. These were the narratives that would change my life. Because in that field, with those freedom riders, the Lord told me that this is how history should be learned. That people should be taught from those who lived it. That honestly revisiting the past could inform our future. To this day, that moment in that field was the most profoundly powerful experience of my life. And it was the moment that Museum Without Walls was born. Museum Without Walls was born with the mission to journey to places where histories of intolerance and racism have occurred, and then to have people come to those spots and to talk about it. So it's a living history lesson, much like what I was able to experience with the Freedom Riders. So churches, high school and college groups decide what history they want to explore, and then we create a program for them to include pre-trip education and then travel. And so Museum Without Walls has several sort of historical focuses. So there's Holocaust education. I know Bert sort of went through some of these. Holocaust education, Northern Ireland and the Troubles, locally Japanese internment and civil rights history. But I would definitely say that the civil rights movement is the historical anchor of what Museum Without Walls does. By talking back to history, we have a chance to discuss racism, oppression, and justice with a 21st century lens. Now, in founding Museum Without Walls, I realized I was sort of in this unique position to lead it. We facilitate both faith and non-faith-based programs, but a significant portion of what we do is within the religious community. Now, my father was an Army chaplain from the Baptist tradition, and while growing up, we would go to church on base, which was an hour and 15 minutes religious experience. And then we would go off base to a Black Baptist church, which was our church home. I mean, we were Baptist. No matter where we went to church, we were Baptist. So when I moved to Seattle, my dad said, you don't have to do any work. I already know the church you're going to go to. You're going to go to Mount Zion Baptist Church. He knew Dr. McKinney. He said, I think you will really like him as a pastor, and I think you'll enjoy the worship there, and that's where I think you should go, which, thank you, Dad. But on the way to Mount Zion, I got sidetracked. One Sunday, I was at the top of Queen Anne, and I turned a corner, and there was this beautiful church on the Ave, and it was letting out, and there were all these people who were my age. They were young. At that time, young was 20s and 30s. Now, young is 50, but back then, it was, 20s and 30s. And they looked so joyful, and I thought, wow, I wonder what's going on there. And I want to come back there. So the very next week, I went to Bethany, and within 5 minutes, I knew that I was home. And I called my parents to tell them that I had joined a church, and they were thrilled. And they said, well, now, what church did you join? And I know they were expecting something different, but I said, Bethany Presbyterian Church. And there was a beat. And then one of my parents said, but we don't know any Presbyterians. And I said, you do now. So worship, the tradition, faith, is very important to what we do with Museum Without Walls. And whatever history we're covering, whether it be with a school district school or with the church, we always include worship. So if we're in Ireland, we go to Catholic Mass. If we are doing a Holocaust trip, we like to do a Shabbat service. When we go down south, we will go to an African American church. And sometimes it's a church you've heard of before, like 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, or Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. And sometimes it's a church you've never heard of, like the church we attend in Nashville, which is the Metropolitan Interdenominational Church. Now, this was a church community that befriended and then held the funeral for James Earl Ray in 1968. Now, understanding how churches are the same and how they're different has been key in doing work with Museum Without Walls. The fact that I sort of had a foot in a more white church experience and then also in a black church experience has been really helpful as I do my work. The year before last, my pastor at Bethany, Doug Kelly, which I understand is out here somewhere today, he came to me and he asked me what I thought about doing a trip down south based around Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy. It was a wonderful idea. What I loved most about it is that it wasn't my idea, that the pastor of my mostly white church took the lead in seeking a church experience about civil rights history and issues around mass incarceration. So you see civil rights history and then mass incarceration. So we're looking at the past and the present. And Bethany has been wonderful to me. They have been supportive in volunteers, and I have people on my board that go to Bethany. They've done every program that I have. I would come to them and say, I think we should do one in Northern Ireland. Absolutely, let's do it. So they've been extraordinary to me. But when we're doing trips around race, we sort of run into a challenge. Because in order to have a program where ideas are truly challenged and change is possible, there really must be diversity. I've been on trips where I was the only voice of color, and that's exhausting. And people don't want me speaking for all black people. So you need to have more voices. So in the end, we were able to partner Bethany with Plymouth Congregational, and then also Emerald City Bible Fellowship. We had a group of 30, which is the largest group I have ever taken down south, and it was marvelous. The most impactful moments were when people disagreed, where trust was built to a point where you could argue about white privilege and institutional racism, and you could argue about it in love, and people could hear it in love. Another program that we did was with teenagers, and it was called the Multicultural Scholars Program. And we would take students from an inner-city high school and then students from a suburban high school. There would be two groups of people that would normally never be together. And they would do a month of Saturdays of history and then go down south on a trip. And for 7 years, we were able to watch students not only form friendships outside of their comfort zone, but to engage in really deep conversations with others from dissimilar groups. Now, taking a seat in the past is important, because you cannot heal what you do not know. And there is no healing without forgiveness. And it never ceases to amaze me that some of the people that have seen our country and its worst, as it were, can be the ones leading on the way to forgiveness. Congressman John Lewis says that nonviolence and forgiveness is not just an idea, but it is a way of living for him. Often healing and forgiveness can take time. One of our strongest lessons on forgiveness comes from Museum Without Walls speaker Carolyn McKinstry. Now, she was at the church the day the 4 little girls were killed. They were her friends. She had just said goodbye to them, and she was going up the stairs, and the bomb went off. It almost destroyed her life. Like, even though she went on to marry and go to college and have children, she was still haunted by the bombing. At one point, she suffered from chronic depression. At one point, she sat down and she wrote a letter to God asking him to release her from her despair. This was his response. Carolyn, I need you to tell people that this is not about skin color or ethnicity or religion. It is about love. It is about forgiveness. It is about reconciliation. I need you to be my messenger. Tell them when they are reconciled to me, they can be reconciled to each other. Mrs. McKinstry still speaks to groups, and her message is always on forgiveness. I believe that every Museum Without Walls program has the power to educate, empower, inspire, even rebuke the past. But when you come back from a program, people tend to be really inspired and really jazzed, and they want to do something. And the question is always there, well, now what do we do? There's not a universal answer. The next step can be sweeping, like students on our group who've decided to attend historical Black colleges, or decide to teach inner city students, or to attend seminary. Some of our adults have come back and switched to entirely different careers with social justice as its center. But not everyone's going to do that. You can't expect that. There needs to be another answer. This is what one of my former students sent me when I'd seen her recently. We were in Amsterdam, and she's working there. And as we were leaving, she was like, "Oh, man, Suzzanne, I just want to tell you again how Museum Without Walls has, affected me." And she'd gone on the program 14 years ago. And I said, "Could you write that in an email, because I'm giving a speech in a few weeks, and I want to be able to quote you." So she sent me a message, and this is the part that I want to share with you. She said, "Overall, I gained an invaluable awareness of America's history and modern-day truths, and I have used that awareness to be a more informed, involved, and compassionate person. The lessons I learned from Museum Without Walls shaped me into the person I am today, and it has affected how I approach the world." It is our hope that participants return home with a fresh view of the world, that the history they learn through the program opens their eyes to everyday injustice. We want participants to know that you don't have to change your life with a new career or moving to a different part of the city, but being able to identify intolerance and act as an ally in everyday situations is what builds justice in our communities. Poet Maya Angelou said, "Once you know better, you do better." For me, the next step was the most difficult. For even though the Lord had called me to this work, and I knew that's what I was supposed to do, I couldn't quite do it full time. So I decided to take a series of part-time jobs. So I'll do Museum Without Walls part-time, and then I'll take this other job so I can, eat. But those part-time jobs never worked out, and I was having a hard time making ends meet. And my very last part-time job was at a wonderful church, and I was let go because of budget issues. And so I'm sitting in my office, and I'm thinking, well, what do I do now? And so I heard God talk to me again. And I really listened this time. I heard that this work he was calling me to do would be hard, that I would be working with people who might have vastly different views from my own, that I would be raising my support, that I would never have the stability that I had as a journalist. But I also heard God tell me that he would walk with me, that my life would be full in ways I couldn't even imagine. And not once since I decided to follow his call, really, really follow his call, has he failed in his promise. I've never wondered where my next meal would come from. I've never wondered where I would live. None of those problems when I was kind of doing Museum Without Walls halfway. I like to encourage people to look into their own family's history, talk to grandparents or parents about their history, ask hard questions. Knowing where you came from is one of the most grounding experiences. Knowing that I am the great-great-granddaughter of Ben and Harriet Lacey, who walked off the plantation and taught themselves how to read, led me to that moment in the field. It led me to Museum Without Walls, and it led me to the opportunity to address you in this space today. And I thank you, and I am honored for you giving me the time. Thank you.
Suzzanne, thank you so much for sharing your heart and your call to God's work in the way that you have. And again, as a reminder for those of you who are interested in follow-up conversations, Ken will be present in the Whitworth room, and Suzzanne and I will be present in the chapel, and that's starting in about 10 minutes. So take a break, and then we'll see you in those rooms. Thank you for your afternoon time. Oh, sorry.
More. But wait, there's more. Do go to the talkbacks. Thank you again to our testimony speakers for your wonderful stories. A reminder, if you want to be part of the choir and the anthem in worship this afternoon, that you will meet to rehearse in here at 3 p.m. Worship will begin at 4 p.m. So between now and 4:15, worship will begin at 4:15. So between now and then, you've got some free time. Go to the talkbacks, come to the choir rehearsal, check out the bookstore. After worship, the PCUSA seminaries have come together to offer a reception to celebrate the work of the seminaries, and we would like to invite all of you to come, and to encourage that, they're offering everyone a free drink. So come over to the hotel for that reception. I don't remember what room it's in, but it's in the app. It's in the lower level of the hotel over at the Renaissance, the Madison room. Thank you. And then there's a People of Color gathering tonight here in the Whitworth room at 8 p.m. So that's what the rest of the day looks like. And we'll see you back for worship at 4:15. Go in peace.